A strange part of adult life now is learning how to look harmless to machines. Not honest, not responsible, just predictable enough not to get flagged, delayed, locked out, or priced differently. That sounds abstract until it reaches into ordinary life. A purchase you almost make, then delay. A trip you almost book, then push to morning. A turn you take more gently because an app is watching how you drive. A face scan you hold still for like your own identity might slip if you move too fast. That is the real subject here. Not that machines are taking over, that they are teaching people how to behave before anything even happens. The systems are already here. Fraud detection on your bank card, risk models around your credit, insurance telematics scoring how you brake and accelerate, ID verification tools deciding whether your face, your lighting, your timing look right, behavior flagging systems deciding something feels off before any human ever sees it. And once those systems touch money, travel, identity, or insurance, people adapt fast. They hesitate before buying something expensive. They space out transactions. They avoid last-minute travel because it feels like the kind of thing that creates questions. They drive more gently because the app rewards smoothness. You've felt this before, not as panic, as friction. Refresh the checkout page, switch cards, wait until tomorrow, book the flight in the morning. Don't make the transfer right after the purchase. Don't do too much at once. And that is where it gets darker. Because this is not really about being watched. It is about behaving like you are already under review. Nobody has to threaten you directly. The pressure comes from smaller things. A card decline that makes no sense. A fraud text after a normal purchase. A premium that quietly shifts. A face scan that fails twice and suddenly makes you feel like your own identity is slightly incorrect. The system does not need to punish you often. It just needs to make unpredictability feel expensive. Because once you start thinking that way, adulthood begins to split in two. On the surface, it still looks like maturity, budgeting, planning ahead, being responsible. Underneath, something colder starts forming. You stop asking what you want to do. You start asking what will look stable. That is how a lot of modern control works. Not through commands, through incentives. Banks do not need to explain every fraud model for people to internalize them. Insurance apps only need to reward smoothness, often enough that abruptness starts to feel childish. ID verification tools do not need to accuse you of anything. Failing once is usually enough to leave a mark. So, the lesson gets absorbed in pieces. Do not move too suddenly with money. Do not look chaotic with travel. Do not behave irregularly around systems tied to access. At some point, this became normal. Not because people trust these systems, because they know what inconvenience costs. When a system misreads you, it feels like friction with no center. A closed door with no person behind it. Someone whose card gets frozen on a trip does not just remember the inconvenience. They remember the embarrassment. Standing at a counter, looking at a phone, calling a number, hearing that calm synthetic voice while needing access to something basic. The lesson lands the same way. Next time, be easier to read. That is where explanation ends and exposure begins. Because the most effective part of these systems is not the moment they intervene. It is the part where they do not have to. The person intervenes first. The person smooths out the purchase before making it, delays the booking, separates the charges, keeps the route simple, avoids the strange hour, holds still for the scan before the scan even struggles. A small performance starts. Not honesty, not responsibility, harmlessness. A frozen card is annoying. Editing yourself in advance is something else. A lot of modern control is polite. It looks like convenience with conditions. Access, as long as your behavior forms a clean enough story. Freedom, as long as it keeps producing legible data. And when that logic sits in your life long enough, it moves inward. You stop experiencing spontaneity as freedom. You experience it as a variable. That weekend trip starts to feel less spontaneous and more messy. Too many charges close together, too many location changes, too much behavior that does not tell a clean story. So instead of doing something because you want to, you start building little explanations in your head for an audience that is not even there. You didn't notice when it started. That is the humiliating part. Not that a machine can misread you. That you start rehearsing innocence for one, waiting 10 minutes before the second purchase. Choosing the softer route because the driving app punishes hard brakes. avoiding the late-night transfer because it might look unusual, holding still for identity verification, like a person trying not to startle something fragile, doing tiny rituals that make no sense in human life and perfect sense in machine life, then calling that maturity. That is the micro-shock. It is worse than inconvenience, because inconvenience ends when the system clears you. This does not. This stays. It becomes part of your timing, your habits, your sense of what responsible people do. And then it spreads. Once you learn to look stable for systems attached to money, insurance, identity, and access, that habit does not stay there. It leaks into how quickly you say yes, how late you are willing to change plans, whether impulse starts to feel embarrassing, whether your own life begins to look suspicious when it gets too uneven. You can hear it in the way people talk now. I'm just being smart. Better not trigger anything. I'll wait until tomorrow. Let's keep it simple. That last line says more than it sounds like, because once keep it simple becomes a survival instinct, you are not just organizing a day, you are organizing yourself around less friction, around a version of adulthood built to pass through systems cleanly. So people start building lives with smoother edges, not because smooth is better, because roughness now has administrative consequences. A person who drives for the insurance score starts braking differently, even when they are alone. A person who once got flagged for travel starts planning like someone preparing a defense. A person who has failed identity verification a few times starts treating their own face like a credential that can expire under bad lighting. You are not just living, you are staying clear. And once staying clear becomes part of adulthood, the cost hides inside respectable language. Discipline, prudence, stability, low risk, good words, useful words, but some of them now mean this. Do not be too sudden. Do not be too irregular. Do not be too emotional. Do not be too hard to model. That is where it gets personal. Because by now the system is no longer only teaching you what to avoid, it is teaching you which parts of yourself are expensive. The impulsive part and the messy part and the part that changes plans late, spends strangely, moves fast, slows down for private reasons, says yes without building a clean pattern first. Those parts start to feel immature, not because they are, because they create messy data. And that is how a person can slowly confuse self-erasure with responsibility. You can feel the trap in the smallest moments. Standing in a parking lot before sending money, sitting in the car and easing off the brake because the app is listening, looking at a late-night booking and deciding to wait until morning so the pattern looks cleaner, canceling the thing you wanted to do because the wrong combination of timing, spending, and movement suddenly feels like too much. Not too much for you. Too much to explain. That is the philosophical crack. A real human life is not smooth. It includes bad timing, emotional decisions, strange generosity, irrational detours, sudden trips, purchases made because something mattered in the moment, days that do not form a clean story, reasons you cannot translate into behavior data. That used to be called living. Now a lot of it gets quietly recoded as risk. Not illegal, not immoral, just irregular enough to create friction. So, normal becomes less of a personality and more of a performance, a way of moving through systems without attracting review. And if you do that for long enough, you stop noticing the performance as performance. It just feels like adulthood, which is useful because it keeps the loss from sounding like loss. But something is being traded away, not in one dramatic moment, in small corrections, the paused purchase, the softened break, the delayed trip, the rehearsed face at the camera, the decision not to do the thing because it might complicate the pattern. Most people say they want freedom. What they often mean is uninterrupted access. Access to money, access to travel, access to insurance rates that do not climb, access to platforms that do not slow them down, access to an identity that verifies cleanly on the first try, access to a life that keeps moving as long as nothing about it looks too strange. So they protect that access. They protect it by becoming easier to read. And after a while, the danger is not just that the system gets better at tracking people, it is that people get better at flattening themselves for it, before it even has to ask. Less impulsive, less uneven, less alive in the ways that do not fit a model, but narrower. No speech announces this. No law needs to explain it fully. It just becomes a private adult skill nobody names. The ability to keep your life moving by keeping it predictable enough to pass. And if you do that long enough, the question stops being whether the systems are fair. It becomes whether the version of you that keeps passing is still fully yours. If survival means acting predictable enough for a machine, how much of your real life can still remain?